Before I get into things, I want to let you know that at the end of the video there's a link to a free gameplay prototype that I've built. Stick around to hear more about it. Four years ago, I started working on a game with a deep, personally meaningful story. It was going to have a fascinating world of robots that could engineer creatures, and levels where you explore into the minds of those robots while simultaneously diving deeper into the psychology of the protagonist. But the gameplay was just a platformer, pretty standard for indie fare. I made a complete rough draft of the story, including dialogue, blocked out cutscenes, and placeholder areas for boss battles, all in the engine. I was making good progress, but then my health took a turn for the worse. I could barely eat and lost over 40 pounds. I was in pain constantly. While that was going on, I had to stop working on my game. I was sick like that for a year and a half, and I'm still getting better. During that time, I dreamed up another game with a much simpler story. Save the princess from the baddies, but it had a much more interesting gameplay loop. Run and gun, bullet hell action with upgrades and RPG elements, where you switch between two customizable characters on the fly and take down crazy bosses. You see, there are two reasons why I play games. For the story, which is why I love JRPGs like Final Fantasy, and for the fun, which is why I love the dumb arcadey action of games like Castle Crashers or Borderlands. About 2 months ago, I finally started feeling well enough to really get back into making games, but I didn't know which direction to go. I could keep making the game that I've been making for 4 years, or switch gears and make something that I thought had more exciting gameplay. But after playing around with ideas in a new engine and praying about what to do, it hit me. I don't have to choose. The strengths of one game were the weaknesses of the other. So why not take the gameplay I find most exciting and fuse it with the story that's the most interesting? My game could be reborn as something that has the strengths of both ideas. So I asked myself, what would that even look like?
Jared is an engineer and roboticist plagued with nightmares of his past, and runs away from Earth to get a clean slate aboard a freight ship called the Return. He's accompanied by Blizz, his AI companion, who worried for him and decided to stow away. But just as she's discovered, the ship crash lands on a planet where the laws of engineering and biology are flipped, and machines can engineer creatures the way that we engineer machines. To get help finding enough scrap to get the ship repaired and continue on with his clean slate, Jared agrees to help Ephraim find his brother, Isaac, who mysteriously disappeared from their village one night.
Alright, that's probably enough ham and cheese. This is where the gameplay and story connect. For what I have planned, Jared and Ephraim will be able to swap in and out to fight off enemies in a gigantic city, where the creatures are engineered to kill. As the player does so, they'll earn scrap for the ship, and money to buy equipment and upgrades for themselves to face bigger challenges in the city, which will peak with gigantic set-piece boss battles. Now, ask a lot of developers and they'll tell you that gameplay should take priority over just about everything else. The game I'd been working on for the past few years lacked that focus on unique gameplay in favor of telling a complex story. And story is important for sure, but my hope now is to spice things up with moment-to-moment gameplay that can stand up on its own. I've got a lot of ideas for mechanics brainstormed, but it's going to be a lot to chew on, so over the past month I decided to make a prototype of the core gameplay elements that I'm hoping to capture. Now, if you're not really interested in how the prototype was made, I'll leave a link in the description for you to go ahead and play it now. Keep in mind that it's just a starting point, and I'll be using it as a base to build on. But other than that, I'd love to hear your feedback. So let's get into it. In my last video, I explained that while I was feeling out Godot, I'd be experimenting with mechanics and iterating on them to make something interesting to build off of, while also planning out story changes and making a high-level production plan. So let me show you what that ended up looking like. The main thing that I was going for with the prototype was to make two characters that played differently and that you have to switch between to manage your health while still doing the whole bullet hell thing. To start out with, I implemented basic player behavior for Jared, then I made it so that the player can switch between Jared and Ephraim with a button press. I wanted their movement to feel kind of different, so I made it so that Jared is a little faster and can double jump, while Ephraim gets one relatively big jump but is a bit slower. Then I moved on to shooting. To make the two characters feel different here as well, I made it so that Jared's bullets fly in a direct path, where Ephraim's arrows follow like an arced ballistic trajectory. Since Jared was meant to be the more nimble of the two, I wanted to balance them out, so I gave Ephraim a little bit of extra firepower with like an alternate sticky grenade that he could lob at enemies to make them float away in a one-hit KO, with the idea that he'd only get like a limited amount of them to use. Now, this isn't going to be much of a run and gun without being able to take and dish out damage, so I moved on to that next. My idea here was to make it so that there's no health pickups in the game, and that to heal you had to switch out your character. By doing this, the action can keep going basically indefinitely, and also hopefully encourages the player to actually use both characters. I also inserted a small difference between Jared and Ephraim here too, with Ephraim having a bit more health than Jared, making Jared quick and nimble but also squishy. At this point I finally felt like I could start making the actual prototype. But first, another balance check. It's really important to me to make both of the characters feel decent to play, and Ephraim still felt kind of underpowered at this point because he's slower and harder to aim with than Jared. So to balance out those downsides, I turned his normal attack into a burst fire shot that you can charge up, and made each shot deal more damage. Now onto the really fun part, the boss battle. When designing levels for a game, I follow the philosophy that you should make the boss battle first if you're going to have boss battles. That way you set the benchmark for how hard the level ought to be, and what skills the player needs to master by the time you get to the boss. For my prototype, the boss battle is supposed to feel like a classic bullet hell, with lots of bullets flying across the screen and interesting patterns the player has to dodge, with it being hard enough that the player may have to switch back and forth between Ephraim and Jared multiple times, watching their health closely. The boss didn't feel hectic enough at first, so to throw a wrench in things, I also made it possible for it to spawn in enemies. That made it feel a lot more satisfying to play through. Now I could actually build a level. Since this is just a gameplay prototype, I didn't feel too tied down to make the level feel like anything in particular from the story I have planned. I just wanted to make something that could function as a level. Now, you might have noticed that at this point, Ephraim's looking a little stiff. And like a monk. In space. He desperately needs a makeover. So I threw out his original sprite and gave him a new look and fleshed out his animation. With Jared being a sort of sea green, I decided on making Ephraim red so that he'd stick out a lot more. After dropping him in and testing him out, I was pretty happy with things, so I added a few little decorations to the level and called the prototype finished. Well, that's what I thought anyway. After sitting it down in front of a few people, they pointed out how empty the game looked. That, and there were still a bunch of quality of life features that were missing and that people kept asking about. If I wanted to get more specific feedback with the actual mechanics, I needed to make sure there weren't obvious issues with the prototype as a game unto itself. I got some really good feedback that levels should tell a sort of story with their design. Even though this is just a prototype, I figured there had to be some way to make this level feel like it had more of a sense of place. I had a bunch of art assets and decorations left over from the years I'd spent on my game before, so I decided to get creative and use them as debris floating around the level to give it some visual interest. So I coded up some behavior to make a sprite float up and down and have it rotate slowly like it's in zero gravity. It seemed to work pretty well to start, but I ran into a few bugs. I also played around with having a layer of debris in the foreground that would parallax back and forth with the player, but it ended up feeling super weird, so I discarded it. I was pretty happy with the debris overall, though. Adding it made the prototype feel a lot more surreal, so I decided to lean into that. I made the walls of the level begin and end sporadically to make it feel like it's a derelict spacecraft. I also added nebulas in the background of space to give the prototype some more color, and as a last minute tweak, I decided to swap out the generic stars passing in the background with ones and zeros. Subtle, but I think it adds a little bit of mystique, like the whole thing is happening in another plane of existence. Playing through it again, it's amazing how much of a difference decorations made in the end. Without them, the prototype felt kind of soulless, but with them, it felt like a game. And at the same time, Ephraim was actually starting to feel a little too powerful and needed to be rebalanced. So I decided to turn Ephraim's limited use sticky grenades into a secret unlockable, and gave Jared an unlockable weapon upgrade of his own. And with that, there's one last piece missing. You guys. The prototype is already up for you guys to play, so I'll pin it in the comments. Fusing together two completely different game ideas is going to be really tricky, and I need all the feedback I can get if I'm going to be able to pull it off. So let me know what you think. After I get your feedback, my next goal is to make another prototype. It's going to be like a prologue of the full game, so I'm going to start implementing systems like dialogue, currency, cutscenes, leveling up, and equipment. Essentially, if this first prototype is the core gameplay mechanics, the next prototype will be figuring out how to tell a story while building on top of the existing gameplay. I expect this next stage will take a few months to complete since there's a lot to consider, but I'll be right here, sharing my progress with you all and getting your feedback. So that's what I've been up to this past month. Go play the prototype and let me know what you think. If you want to follow development more closely, or even just chat with me and ask questions about game development, hop onto my Discord. Let me know what you think of this video down in the comments. If you like this video, give it a like, and if you want to see more, subscribe and hit the notification bell. I upload a video about every 4 to 6 weeks. Until next time.